New fish. Edward said. Smile for me. The punch landed flat and open-handed across Terrell's jaw, loud enough to bounce off the guard tower glass. 50 men in gray still went. Welcome to my block, boy. Terrell's head rolled with the impact, then came back to center on its own, slow, unhurried. He didn't touch his face. He didn't say a word. Laughter from the crowd. Nothing to say. Edward grinned at his crew, playing to the audience now. I like that. Quiet ones last longer. He leaned in close enough that Terrell could smell the cafeteria coffee on his breath. Quiet ones just haven't broken yet. Near the rail, Officer Randall Voss watched with his keys hanging loose in one hand. He clocked the moment, filed it away as nothing worth writing down, and looked toward the yard gate instead. Terrell stood there, jaw already starting to swell, pulse steady as a metronome. Under his sleeve, his right hand folded shut, not in anger, but in memory. 21 fights had taught that hand exactly what it was capable of. 14 knockouts had taught it exactly what it should never be used for again. He let it open, finger by finger, and dropped it back to his side. Not yet. Have you ever watched a man get hit and choose, on purpose, to do absolutely nothing about it? If this story has already got you hooked, drop a like and subscribe before we go any further. You're not going to want to miss where this one goes. Greystone Correctional sat behind 4 rings of fencing and a stretch of 2-lane road that hadn't seen new pavement in a decade. 900 men lived inside its walls, and every one of them had learned the same lesson fast: silence wasn't a weakness here. Silence was armor. Silence was the only thing nobody could take from you twice. Terrell Davis had been inside for 9 days. Before Greystone, his name meant something outside these walls too. Middleweight champion, 21 wins, 1 loss, a chin nobody in 3 states had ever managed to crack. A promoter once slid a contract across a table in a downtown steakhouse, real money, the kind that changes a family's whole future. Terrell read it twice, folded it back along its crease, and pushed it back across the table. My daughter was born 6 weeks ago, he said. I made her promise these hands are done hurting people. He meant it as a father. He didn't know yet how much that promise was about to cost him as an inmate. Then came the night that undid everything: a bar fight 2 blocks from his gym, a scuffle he tried to break up instead of start, a witness who couldn't tell one tall black man from another under bad lighting. A public defender juggling 40 cases that month. A jury that took less time deciding his fate than it takes to eat a meal. He never raised his voice at the verdict. He just looked down at his own hands, the same ones that had ended fights in seconds, and made himself one more promise. In here, those hands stay down. That promise was easy to make in a courtroom. It was about to get a lot harder to keep in a place like Greystone. But to understand exactly what Edward Haynes had just woken up, you have to go back further, to a gym with worn ropes, a newborn girl wrapped in a hospital blanket, and the night Terrell Davis decided his fists would only ever be for the ring again. Riverside Boxing Club sat above a laundromat, 2 blocks from the apartment Terrell grew up in. He'd trained there since he was 12, and by 26 he owned a record most men never touched in a lifetime. 21 wins. 1 loss, on points, a decision he still disagreed with. A chin nobody in 3 states had managed to crack, and hands quick enough that trainers from other gyms would drop by just to watch him hit the pads. He could have chased the bigger purses. Vegas cards. National television. A manager once told him, flat out, that he was leaving 6 figures on the table every year he stayed local. Terrell just kept training at the same gym, under the same tin roof, because his mother was 2 blocks away and his whole life was built on staying close to the people who mattered. Then his daughter was born. He held her for the first time in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and new beginnings, 4 pounds of a Terrell in miniature, and something in him reorganized itself completely. He made her a promise before she even had her eyes fully open, a promise that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what kind of man she'd grow up watching. These hands are for the ring. Never the street. He kept that promise for 6 more years. Trained fighters. Coached youth boxing on Saturdays. Turned down 2 more contracts because leaving meant time away from her he wasn't willing to trade. Then came the night outside Miller's Tavern. A fight broke out between 2 men he didn't know. Terrell stepped between them the way any responsible adult might, hands up, voice calm, trying to keep it from getting worse. Somebody swung. Somebody hit the pavement. By the time police arrived, all the bar's bad lighting and worse memory could offer was a description that fit half the black men in the neighborhood: tall, broad-shouldered, fighter's build. Terrell was tall. Terrell was black. Terrell had a fighter's build. The identification took 11 seconds. The public defender had 38 other cases that month and met Terrell for the first time 20 minutes before the hearing. The jury deliberated for less time than it takes to eat a meal, and came back with the answer that required the least imagination. He didn't raise his voice at the verdict. He looked at his own hands, the ones that had never once thrown a punch outside a sanctioned ring, and made himself the only promise he had left. Keep them down. Do the time. Get home to her. 6 weeks later, a transport van pulled through 3 gates and a wall of razor wire, and Terrell Davis walked into Greystone Correctional carrying nothing but that promise and a folded photograph of a little girl who didn't yet understand where her father had gone. Edward Haynes had been running Block D for 11 years, ever since a card game disagreement ended with another man in a coma and Edward's sentence stretched long enough to make the block his permanent address. 41 years old, bald by choice long before prison made the decision for him, 230 pounds built entirely on prison yard iron and idle time. He didn't need to raise his voice to get a room's attention. He'd learned a long time ago that silence, used right, was scarier than shouting. He called new arrivals tribute, and he meant it literally. A man's first week in Block D came with a tax, commissary handed over without argument, phone minutes signed away, small dignities surrendered one at a time until there was nothing left to take. Edward didn't think of it as cruelty. He thought of it as rent. Everybody paid rent somewhere. His just happened to be collected in instant coffee and stamps. What made it all possible wasn't Edward's size. It was Officer Randall Voss. Voss had worked the D block floor for 6 years, long enough to know exactly when to be somewhere else. When Edward collected, Voss found paperwork that needed his attention at the far end of the hall. When a camera might catch something worth catching, Voss remembered, conveniently, that the unit needed servicing. Nobody had ever used the word arrangement out loud. Nobody had to. It ran on nods and timing, the same quiet machinery that had kept Block D problem-free on every report Voss filed for half a decade. So when Edward slapped the new arrival in the yard that morning, it wasn't an event to him. It was a formality. Routine business, the same test he'd run on every man who'd walked through Greystone's gates during his 11 years inside. Most flinched. Some begged. A few cried, which Edward found the most satisfying of all, because tears meant the tribute would keep coming without him having to ask twice. He looked at Terrell Davis and saw exactly what he expected to see, a slim, quiet man with downcast eyes, shoulders slightly forward, saying nothing while 50 men watched him get hit. To Edward, that posture only ever meant one thing. Fear. He'd built a small kingdom reading that same signal correctly for over a decade, and he had no reason to think today was any different. He didn't know what he was actually looking at. He didn't know the downcast eyes were a fighter's habit, the same measured stillness a boxer holds between rounds, saving everything for when it's needed. He didn't know the silence wasn't surrender, it was arithmetic, a man doing the math on what one wrong move could cost him. He didn't know about the 21 wins, or the promise made in a hospital room, or the hands that had been trained since childhood to do exactly nothing until the exact right moment. Edward Haynes saw weakness. The whole block did. They were all looking at the wrong thing. The slap had been a test. What came after was a campaign. Edward understood power the way some men understand weather. You didn't force it all at once, you let it build, until the other man forgot he'd ever owned anything to begin with. So he started small, and he made it last. Day 2, the chow hall. Terrell took a corner seat, tray in front of him, and made it almost all the way through the meal before Edward's shadow fell across the table. "You're in my seat," Edward said, though 40 other seats sat empty around them. Terrell reached for his tray to move it himself. Edward got there first. One thick hand flipped it clean off the table. Gray meatloaf and a carton of milk hit the floor in a slow, sickening spread. "Clean it up," Edward said. "You made a mess." Terrell knelt. He gathered what he could. He wiped the floor with a napkin that fell apart in his hand before he was done, and he did it without a word, the way a man does a thing he's decided to survive rather than fight. The hall laughed. Not everyone. Enough. Night 3, he came back to his cell and found his family photo slid under the bars, a boot print stamped clean across his daughter's face. He picked it up. He wiped it clean with his thumb and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to a wall that wouldn't answer back. Night 4, his commissary vanished, the soap, the stamps, the coffee he'd bought with money he didn't have to spare. He found the empty wrappers arranged in a neat little row on his pillow. A signature. Somebody wanted him to know exactly who'd done it, and exactly how little it had cost them to do. Night 5, the letters stopped. Terrell wrote his daughter every single day, short notes, nothing fancy, just enough to remind a 6-year-old that her father hadn't disappeared, only gone somewhere he couldn't leave yet. He waited for her to reply the way a man underwater waits on air. And then they simply stopped arriving. Somewhere between the mailroom and his cell, they piled up in a place they shouldn't have, and Officer Voss's paperwork never once mentioned a backlog. Each night, Terrell lay on his bunk and fought a war nobody else in the block could see. One swing. That was all it would take to feel like himself again for exactly 1 second, and lose everything that mattered for years afterward. Then came the phone call. For minutes, tear phone, his aunt's voice thin and careful. "She keeps asking why you stopped writing," she said. "She thinks she did something wrong." Terrell closed his eyes. Down the tier, Edward's laugh rolled past like weather that never broke. "Tell her I didn't stop," he said quietly. "Tell her I'm coming home." He hung up, pressed his forehead to the cold cinder block, and breathed in for 4 counts, out for 4, the way his old trainer taught him to do between rounds, back when quitting was only ever a thought and never a choice. The library was the one quiet place in Greystone. Edward didn't read, and neither did his crew, which made the small room with its sagging shelves feel less like a part of the prison and more like a place that had simply been forgotten by it. Terrell went there for exactly that reason, not for the books, but for the silence that didn't come with a price attached. An old man sat at the far table, gray beard, half glasses low on his nose, a chessboard open in front of him though no one was there to play. He watched Terrell find a seat, watched the way he set his hands flat on the table before he did anything else, a habit, not a choice, and something in the old man's face shifted like he'd found a page he'd been looking for. "I know those shoulders," he said. Terrell looked up. "Otis Kane," the man said. "Cut man, 30 years, 3 different champions before my hands got too shaky for the corner." He tapped the table once. "You're Davis. I saw you take the state title. Round 9. Check hook nobody in the building saw coming, including the man you hit with it." Terrell said nothing, but something in his posture eased, just slightly, the way it does when a stranger turns out not to be one. "I'm not here to fight," Terrell said finally. "I know that too." Otis leaned in. "That's exactly why they think you're weak. Out there," he nodded toward some direction that meant the whole world beyond the fences, "that restraint made you a champion. Best discipline I ever trained. But in here, son, it's getting you killed. Slow, but it's getting you killed." What's your plan? Otis asked, when Terrell didn't answer right away. Keep my head down. Do my time. Get home to my daughter. And if they don't let you? Terrell's jaw tightened. He had no answer for that one, and Otis didn't wait for him to invent one. Edward doesn't see a man holding a line, Otis said. He sees a man who's already lost. That's the whole problem. Discipline and fear look the same to somebody who's never had to tell the difference. He sat back, folding his hands the way a cornerman does when the bell is close. You don't start it. But son, you finish it. Terrell turned the words over long after Otis had gone back to his chessboard, long after lights out, long after the block had gone quiet around him. He didn't know yet if he agreed. He only knew that somewhere along the last 11 days, the whole block had started reading his silence as surrender, and not one of them had asked what he was actually counting down to. He wasn't ready to answer that question. Not yet. But for the first time since the gates closed behind him, he let himself wonder how much longer "not yet" could hold. 11 days, and the quiet man still hadn't broken. Edward had run this exact playbook a dozen times before, on a dozen different men, and it had never once failed to work by day 7. Flipped trays. Stolen commissary. A little pressure applied in the dark, night after night, until whatever pried a man walked in with wore down to nothing. But Terrell Davis kept absorbing it, kept saying nothing, kept looking at Edward with those same steady eyes that never once dropped the way they were supposed to. It stopped being funny somewhere around day 9. By day 11, it had become personal. Time we finish what we started, Edward told his crew that morning, low enough that only they could hear it. Laundry room. Tonight. The laundry room sat at the dead end of C Wing, past the last working camera on the tier, a detail Edward had learned the way he'd learned everything useful in this place, by watching who got written up and who didn't. Officer Randall Voss had the floor that night. When the moment came, Voss found a reason to be at the far desk, back to the hallway, paperwork spread out in front of him like a man determined to be very busy about something that didn't exist. Terrell hadn't planned to be there. He'd gone to wash up before lockdown, same as any other night, and heard the door swing shut behind him before he'd even reached the sinks. Then the bolt. A single metal sound, final as a verdict. He turned. 4 men stood between him and the door. Edward in front, 2 of his crew flanking him on either side, a 4th man near the exit with something small and dark held low in his hand. Terrell's eyes went to it on instinct, the way a fighter clocks any object in a room before he clocks the men holding it. A phone. Recording. They wanted this filmed. A trophy. Something to pass hand to hand around the block until every man in Greystone had watched the quiet one finally break. No more pets, Edward said, cracking his knuckles slowly, one at a time, like he had all the time in the world. Time you learn what happens to quiet boys who don't. You don't want to do this, Terrell said. His voice came out even, almost gentle. Open the door. Walk out. Nobody has to get hurt tonight. Edward laughed, and his crew laughed with him, the sound bouncing flat off the tile walls. Hurt, Edward repeated, savoring it. That's cute. You've been real quiet for 11 days, Davis. I figured you for scared. Turns out you're just slow. He took a step closer. Then another. The water from a dripping showerhead was the only other sound in the room, steady as a countdown nobody else could hear. Last chance to say something, Edward said, close enough now that Terrell could see the grin settling into place, the same grin from the yard 11 days ago. Beg a little. Might make me feel generous. Terrell didn't move. Didn't blink. Somewhere behind his ribs, a switch he'd kept off for 11 days, for 6 years, if he was honest, waited quietly for permission. Edward's arm drew back. The first punch was already on its way. The first punch never landed. It came from the man on Terrell's right, a wiry inmate named Danny Cole, throwing a wild haymaker telegraphed from 3 feet away. To anyone watching later, on a screen, it would look like he simply fell down on his own. To Terrell, time did what it always used to do the moment a bell rang. It slowed, stretched, gave him room to work inside it that nobody else in the room could see. He didn't step back. He didn't need to. He shifted his head an inch, let the fist pass close enough to feel the air off it, and answered with a short left hook to the body, tight, economical, nothing wasted. Danny folded around the punch like a coat sliding off a hook and dropped to the wet tile, gasping for air that wouldn't come easy for a few seconds yet. 1 second. Done. The second man, a heavy-set guy named Marcus Riley, lunged before Danny had even hit the ground, grabbing for Terrell's collar with both hands. Terrell caught the wrist instead, turned his hips into the motion, and used Marcus's own weight against him, redirecting the charge straight into the tiled wall. A short right uppercut met him on the way in. The sound it made was sharp and final, and Marcus slid down the wall and stayed there, eyes swimming, breath ragged. 3 seconds. Then Edward came. He'd built himself around exactly this moment for 11 years, the bull rush, 230 pounds behind it, the same charge that had put another man in a coma over a card game and ended a dozen smaller disputes before anyone else got a word in. He came in wide and certain, arms spread to close the distance and crush whatever was left standing in front of him. Terrell didn't meet it head-on. He pivoted, light on his feet in a way that looked almost unfair for a man his size, and let Edward stumble past him into empty air. As Edward turned, off balance for the first time in longer than he could remember, Terrell stepped in and threw the exact punch Otis Kane had described to him 3 days earlier in the library, the check hook. Short. Tight. Perfect. It landed flush on the jaw with the full turn of his body behind it. Edward's knees went first. Then the rest of him followed, slow at the top and fast at the bottom, hitting the wet floor hard enough that the standing water jumped. 7 seconds. The fourth man, Curtis Boyd, the one who'd been holding the phone, stopped filming his trophy and started, without quite meaning to, filming his own retreat. He backed into the corner, hands shaking so badly the footage would later blur, the camera still pointed forward only because he'd forgotten he was holding it at all. "I'm out," he stammered. "I'm out, man. I'm out." Terrell looked at him, breathing hard but steady, his hands already dropping back to his sides. He hadn't chased a single one of them. He hadn't thrown a punch that wasn't answering one already thrown at him, and not one thing more than that. "Then go," Terrell said. 12 seconds, start to finish. 4 men down. 1 man standing, untouched, water running off his knuckles in the dim overhead light. And then came the part the whole world would eventually watch on a loop, over and over, the part that would matter more than any of the punches that came before it. Terrell didn't gloat. He didn't stand over Edward. He didn't say a single word of victory to a room that had just tried to take something from him that he could never have gotten back. Instead, he walked to Marcus, the one closest to him, still against the wall with his eyes swimming, and knelt down beside him. He checked his breathing. Made sure the rise and fall of his chest was steady before he stood back up. Then he crossed the room, turned off the shower that was still running somewhere behind them, and worked the bolt on the door open with hands that didn't shake at all. He stepped out into the tier, leaving 4 men groaning in the dark behind him, and walked back toward his cell like a man who believed, for just a moment, that the worst of it was finally over. It wasn't. Because Curtis's phone had caught all 12 seconds, every slip, every counter, the check hook that dropped a man who hadn't lost a fight in 11 years, and then the moment that made it impossible to look away. The winner, kneeling in the water, checking whether the man who'd come to hurt him was still breathing. The video left Greystone by morning, smuggled out the way everything leaves a prison, hand to hand, phone to phone, and by nightfall it existed somewhere it could never be put back. The internet did what the internet does. It exploded. By the 3rd day, the clip had a name, 12 seconds. Commentators broke it down frame by frame. Strangers argued in threads that ran 100,000 comments deep. Who was he? Why did a man who moved like that end up in a place like this? And why, when he clearly could have done so much worse, did he stop? Inside Greystone, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was the alarm that cracked the block open less than an hour after Terrell got back to his bunk, boots pounding the corridor, red light strobing, a voice over the speaker flat and absolute. Lockdown. All units. Terrell sat up and watched Officer Voss move past his cell at a near run, radio pressed to his mouth, face white with something that wasn't concern for anyone but himself. By morning, the official version had already hardened into fact. Inmate Terrell Davis, unprovoked, had ambushed 4 men in the C-Wing laundry room. Dangerous. Trained. Concealing a violent history. 4 men in the infirmary, 1 with a fractured jaw. The prison had a duty to act. Nobody in Warden Preston Dukes's office asked why 4 men would corner one in the single room without a working camera. Dukes read the report, looked at the flood of attention the video had already brought down on his facility, and signed the transfer order before lunch. Terrell was moved to solitary, a concrete box the width of a parking space, told it was for his own protection, and not told for how long. Edward played it from a hospital bed, jaw wired, and told the internal review that he'd been attacked without cause. "He's an animal," he wrote on a notepad, underlining it twice. It made him look, if anything, more sympathetic. The truth might have stayed buried there if the video hadn't reached one more person. Marisol Vance had spent 2 decades suing institutions that wrote clean reports over dirty truths, and she had a particular allergy to official stories that arrived too tidy. She watched 12 seconds the way she watched everything, twice, the second time with the sound off. What she saw wasn't what the headlines saw. She saw a man who never advanced. Only counters. For aggressors, 1 defender, and a defender who stopped the instant he could and knelt to check a fallen man's breathing. You didn't get footage like that from an ambush. You got it from a man trying very hard not to hurt anyone more than he had to. She drove to Greystone the next day and took the case for free. What she found, once she started pulling the thread, went far beyond one 12-second video. The TIR camera outside Terrell's cell had been logged as malfunctioning for 7 consecutive nights, the exact 7 nights he'd later described to her in painstaking detail. It came back online, fully functional, the morning after the laundry room. To Vance, a missing tape wasn't the end of a case. It was a confession with the words scratched out. Then came the detail that changed everything. Greystone had quietly installed a secondary pilot camera system 8 months earlier, one that covered the very blind spots the older cameras missed. Officer Voss had never been told about it. Neither had Edward. It had recorded all 7 nights in full, the torn photograph with the boot print across it, the stolen commissary arranged in its taunting row, and finally, the laundry room door bolted from the inside by 4 men who had walked in there to hurt one. At the review hearing, Vance laid it all out for the panel, piece by piece, until the official story had nowhere left to stand. She played the fight in full, then frame by frame, narrating what a trained fighter's restraint actually looked like against 4 attackers with every legal right to defend himself by any means necessary. She asked Officer Voss where he'd been during the incident. "At my desk," he said. "With your back to the TIR," she added. "We have that on camera too." Warden Dukes tried to explain why a man who'd knelt to check another man's pulse had been the one punished. He couldn't. It came apart quickly after that. Edward Haynes was charged with felony assault, a new sentence stacked on top of the one he was already serving. Officer Randall Voss was stripped of his badge and charged with falsifying records. Warden Preston Dukes resigned before the board could vote to remove him, walking out under the same cameras he'd spent his career trying to avoid. Marisol Vance didn't stop at the laundry room. Once the review board had seen how easily a clean report could hide an ugly truth, she went back to the case that had put Terrell inside Greystone in the first place, the bar fight outside Miller's Tavern, the 11-second identification, the public defender who'd met his client 20 minutes before sentencing. She took it apart the same way she'd taken apart everything else. Slowly. In daylight. She found the original security footage, the full version this time, and a witness who, shown a clear photo 3 years later, finally said the words that should have been said the first time. That's not him. That man was heavier. Older. That's not Terrell. The court vacated his conviction on a Tuesday morning. Wrongful imprisonment. Immediate release. Terrell walked out of Greystone through the same 3 gates that had swallowed him 14 months earlier, into a parking lot full of strangers who had followed 12 seconds of his life all the way to this moment. They went quiet as he passed, the way crowds do around something bigger than a headline. He didn't look for the cameras. He looked for one person. His daughter was standing by his aunt's car, taller than he remembered, her hair different, 7 years old now instead of the 6-week-old he'd carried a promise for in a hospital room a lifetime ago. For a second neither of them moved. Then she ran, and he dropped to one knee in the parking lot to catch her, and neither of them said anything at all for a long time because there wasn't a version of this that needed words. "I told everybody you were coming back," she said finally, into his shoulder. "I told them." "I know, baby," he said. "I know you did." He didn't go back to boxing. Not the way people expected. 3 years later, in a converted garage 2 blocks from the old Riverside gym, Terrell hung a single hand-painted sign over the door. No title, no logo. Just 2 words, second chance. The kids came first, the ones the neighborhood had already given up on, the ones teachers called trouble and everyone else called somebody else's problem. Terrell never asked about their records. He asked about their footwork. He taught them the thing Greystone had taught him in a room with no cameras, that real strength was the power you chose not to use. Then came the others. Men fresh out on parole, blinking in daylight, carrying records and nowhere else to go. Some of them had done time in places like Greystone. A few, if he was honest, reminded him of men he'd rather forget. He let them in anyway. He'd learned the hard way that the line between the man on the floor and the man standing over him was thinner than most people wanted to believe, and that mercy, given once, tends to find its way back around. On opening day, an old man with a gray beard and half-glasses sat in a folding chair by the door, watching the ring go up piece by piece the way he'd once watched fighters go up round by round. Otis Kane had made parole 8 months after Terrell's release, and the first call he made from outside was to this address. "Figured you'd need a cornerman," Otis said, when Terrell spotted him. "Figured you'd show up eventually," Terrell said back, and for the first time since the gates closed behind him 3 years earlier, he laughed, really laughed, standing in the middle of a gym with his name on nothing and his fingerprints on everything. He still trained early, before the kids arrived, wrapping his hands the old way, slow, knuckle by knuckle, the way Otis had taught him decades before any of this happened. He'd hit the heavy bag in the gray morning light and think about a yard, a slap, a promise he'd almost broken and somehow, barely, kept. Anybody can throw a punch, he told the kids, every single class, until it stopped being a lesson and started being the only thing they remembered him for. It takes a champion to know when not to. So let me ask you the same thing the story asked at the very start. Have you ever been underestimated? Written off before anyone bothered to learn your name? Judged by a uniform, a record, or a single bad chapter by people who never read the rest of the book? If you have, then you already know exactly what Terrell knew standing in that yard. Tell me in the comments, when has someone underestimated you, and what did you do about it? I read every one. And if you want more stories about the underestimated, the overlooked, and the quietly unbreakable, subscribe. Your corner is right here. Thank you for watching, I will see you in the next one.